All right. Hello all. Now we are going to start the webinar event. First of all, I would like to thank all the attendees for taking out your valuable time to participate in this webinar event titled Market Assessment of Small Wind Turbine System in Nepal, organized by Wind Empowerment. It's a great platform for us to present our work through this webinar, which will also be available online for many of those who aren't able to join in right now. So my name is Kimon Silwal, and I will be facilitating for the today's webinar session. Today we are hosting Mr. Alfred Alsop. Just to give a brief introduction, Mr. Alfred Alsop is a PhD candidate at Strathclyde University Wind and Marine Energy Centre for doctoral training in Glasgow, UK. He received a master's degree in physics from a University of York in 2015 with a thesis written on the feasibility of horizontal axis wind turbine using rotating Magnus cylinders in the place of fixed aerofoils. Alfred's current research involves integrating decision analysis and GIS techniques into market assessment methodologies for small wind turbine in rural electrification context, building upon previous wind empowerment projects to assist policymakers and stakeholders in developing countries in making energy and planning decisions. Alfred joined Wind Empowerment in 2016, assisting the market assessment working group with the global market assessment of small wind turbines, and then joined executive board as the association's treasurer. So before starting the main session, I will kickstart the webinar with a very brief introduction to CAPEG and about the market assessment project. I've been working at CAPEG since 8 years now in different areas of renewable energy development field, especially with small wind turbines and pico and micro hydro system. CAPEG has been working with small wind turbines since its establishment in 2004 with the main purpose of developing the technology utilizing locally available materials with the aim to provide electricity access for the remote off-grid areas of the country. The solar energy system back then was quite expensive. Therefore, the alternative of developing a locally constructed wind turbines was a worthwhile option. CAPEG has been working with small wind turbines since its establishment in 2004 with the main purpose of developing the technology utilizing locally available materials. So we started R&D project to investigate the locally available timber materials most suitable for building small wind turbine blades in Nepal. We began extending the technology know-how by doing different projects to build the wind turbine alternators, towers, and finally the electrification projects in the potential places in the country with turbines ranging from 300 watt to 1 kilowatt system, and also recently with solar wind hybrid mixes. Several projects across the years has been carried out in collaboration with national and international agencies and universities to raise the awareness of the technology in regards to off-grid electrification with small wind turbines. With a growing experience and coming across the constraining factors, we realized that we need more proper research assessment projects needed in the areas of financial delivery, maintenance, resource, and capacity, and therefore started active collaboration with Wind Empowerment Market Assessment Group and initiated the first national market assessment campaign for small wind turbines. The Small Wind Turbine Market Assessment Project is supported by WISIONS, with Wind Empowerment as the project partner, and the collaborator Alternative Energy Promotion Center, AEPC. AEPC is a government institution under Ministry of Energy, Water, Resource, and Irrigation, which works with policy formulation, resource mobilization, technical support, quality assurance, and promotion of renewable energy technologies. The project began on April 2018 with a project period of 5 months. So I would like to thank WISIONS at this point for supporting us with this project, and the team at AEPC who supported us with the number of data collection work and the workshop activities. So to give a brief overview of the project aimed with building upon previous national market assessment carried out by Wind Empowerment members in order to indicate how and where small wind turbines might best contribute to the electrification efforts in Nepal, whilst identifying the opportunities and barriers for implementation and recommending the next steps to optimize the sector. The project included site surveys, techno-economical modeling and mapping with geospatial data, expert interviews, and the knowledge exchange workshops. Factors such as finance, capacity, regulation, policy, market actors, community, physical conditions, and many other viability indicators were brought down to principal contributing factors to identify and understand the scope of small wind turbines in Nepal. End user survey from 6 different solar wind hybrid installation with installation capacity ranging from 6 kilowatt to 35 kilowatt sites were collected. The sites were principally selected based on remoteness and accessibility, size, operating years, and the degree of productive end uses. Geospatial data such as accessibility maps, resource maps, grid maps, terrain maps, and demographic maps were collected and analyzed to produce the inclusion zone, highlighting the areas within Nepal that are anticipated to be most viable for off-grid small wind turbines. Along with this map indicating where the small wind turbine would be most cost optimal off-grid generation is also produced, the details of which will be discussed by Alfred in the next presentation. Stakeholders involved in the small wind turbines and other renewable energy sectors were interviewed to synthesize a national consensus on small wind and identifying the bottlenecks facing the technology. With the analysis of all the data, stakeholders engagement workshop was conducted to disseminate results and findings and stimulate discussions in attempt to arriving at a clear recommendation for the future of this technology in the country. With this final brief and without any further ado, I would like to now invite Mr. Alfred Alsop to start the main session of this webinar event and enlighten us with the results that has been produced through this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimon. That was a fantastic introduction and summary of the project. I will quickly take the screen so I can show what I have to. Oh, here we go. Here we go. So again, Kimon gave a fantastic overview and summary and introduction, so thank you for that. So I will begin my presentation. So just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll give a very quick introduction because Kimon has done such a good job of already doing the same. I will discuss previous market assessments conducted by Wind Empowerment to give some context from where our organization is coming from. I'll give an overview of the Nepali context for small wind and off-grid electrification activities. I will discuss the methodology and the project activities that we conducted to carry out this national market assessment for small wind turbines. I'll then go on to give a short description of the results that we achieved in the process of carrying out this project. Then I will arrive at the recommendations and conclusions for the sector produced by the project itself. Very quickly, the project aim, as Kimon has already alluded to, is to determine where and how small wind can best contribute to off-grid electrification, but also to quantify just how much small wind turbines can contribute and to what financial extent. The project itself made use of Wind Empowerment's market assessment methodology, which has been used previously and developed over the years on a number of different projects in different countries. As Kimon has said, we're very grateful to the WISIONS initiative and to the AEPC for their support over the course of the project. So quickly, just to get rid of an initial misconception, when people hear the term market assessment, they often think of a purely economic project, a purely economic study, and this couldn't be further from the truth. When we conduct a market assessment, what we want to do is we want to consider how well an individual technology can meet the needs of a consumer, and this isn't just a case of thinking, how much profit could be made. It's not about that. So I felt I needed to clarify that, having discussions on similar lines. So the previous market assessments carried out by Wind Empowerment have taken place in Nicaragua, Malawi, and Ethiopia. These weren't carried out by myself, but have been carried out by the Market Assessment Working Group, various members of which have participated in these projects and contributed to a growing depth of knowledge within the Wind Empowerment organization. And what I have hopefully achieved in the Nepal market assessment is I have taken the knowledge and methodological developments that have been carried out in these countries and applied it to the Nepali context. So the methodology I mentioned comes in 3 steps. So the first thing that you must do in order to carry out a market assessment is to learn from previous initiatives. It's important to understand the context because as external experts, we need to quickly be able to understand the history of the technology in a given country and to get to grips with what has and what has not worked previously. Mapping the energy access ecosystem is the fancy way of saying basically we need to understand what other means of energy access exist and how well they're faring and why. So the third point, quantifying the market, is more than just saying the market is, it's this big. It involves highlighting the necessary conditions for success and for growth of the market. So it involves identifying what necessary conditions exist for the market to exist, essentially. So moving on to the context of Nepal for small wind. Nepal is, as many people will be aware, one of the world's most mountainous countries. It has a present electrification rate of approximately 90%, and most of the currently unelectrified population live within the rural mountainous regions of Nepal, where extending the national grid can be incredibly difficult. The map shown here doesn't really illustrate just how mountainous Nepal is. Aside from the Terai, which is the lowlands of the country to the south, the country is hills, mountains, and valleys with incredibly winding roads. So some amazing views, but slow going sometimes. Building transmission lines over these mountains would be incredibly expensive, especially when you're connecting to what is essentially quite a sparse population. And the grid in Nepal is already struggling, although obviously it is doing much better now than it was a few years ago. So adding additional connections and transmission infrastructure will only add to the difficulties that the grid may face. So essentially, the grid needs reinforcement before extension can be carried out. And that's even without regarding the fact that it may be uneconomical to extend the grid to quite small populations in the rural regions. So in terms of what off-grid technologies are being employed in Nepal currently, micro hydropower, or MHP, is the primary off-grid technology, with solar PV seeing a significant increase in utilization due to falling prices. Wind power technology has seen a small number of installations over the years, but nothing to significant scale. So one thing about micro hydro is, from my understanding and from my time in Nepal, it seems to be the aspirational technology for off-grid communities. It has a reputation for being reliable. And if an off-grid community is requiring energy access, they will usually want either a grid connection or they will want micro hydropower, just from the popular perception of the technology. So there's also lots of solar PV getting installed due to lowered prices, as I mentioned, in both rural and urban areas. And some of these are isolated and used for backup only, but some of them are also connected to the grid itself. Moving on to early wind implementations in Nepal, there's been a bit of a troubled past. So one of the first installation projects took place in Kagbeni in the northern Mustang region in 1989, and within, I believe, 3 months of installation, these wind turbines had failed, and this failure was due to extremely high wind speeds. So it's obviously not the fact that there isn't enough wind, but in this case it was a case that there is too much, and the system failed due to structural damage, structural fatigue. But this instance and others like it have affected the perception of wind power technology in Nepal, which is unfortunate, as wind power does have something to offer, as I shall shortly show you. Another interesting thing about Nepal is that recently energy planning responsibilities have been decentralized from the central government to local municipalities. So now it's a case that local municipalities are responsible for their own energy planning procedure and implementation. So whilst this is great and increases the level of democracy and decision making and shifts the decision making towards the end users, it also raises the question of whether these end users have the technical capacity to make educated decisions on the energy planning question. As I've said, the grid is very much the aspirational technology along with micro hydropower, even if in a certain context it may not be the most appropriate technology. So moving on to the methodology and the project activities, discussing what we have done during this project. So as Kimon mentioned previously, there were 6 solar wind hybrid mini-grid systems that were visited by the CAPEC team. And the team carried out site inspections, so inspecting the technology itself, and also surveyed the site technician and the members of the local community. The sites visited were at Tatupani, Kamal Bazar, Harikanda, Boleni, Daubadi, and Harihabagadi. And you can see on this map here the different locations. So 3 in the far west, and then 3 in the more central region of Nepal. Also highlighted on this map are the repair centres and the maintenance hubs for these systems. So we can see that there's Kathmandu there and also Biratnagar down in the right-hand corner. Sometimes these are a little bit too far away from the systems to have enough of an impact, but we will discuss that more later. So these are some photos from the site visits with an indication of the capacity of each system. Kimon, if you have anything to add here about each of the systems, please feel free to speak up. Are you there, Kimon? Oh, he's muted. Never mind, I'll carry on. So I wasn't present myself for these site visits.
Sorry, Alfie, please carry on. I think it's pretty clear in the slide.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's like Kimon said, it's pretty clear in the slides. I wasn't here for these site visits. These were carried out before my arrival in Nepal, but Kimon and the CAPEC team made some fantastic inspections and surveys, which have informed our results and conclusions. So once I'd arrived in Nepal, and indeed previously to that, we carried out a literature review of relevant documents. So this includes policy documents, technical reports, and academic papers that had previously been written on the subject of not only small wind in Nepal, but also the larger electrification in rural areas in Nepal. So this is the learning from existing initiative stage. It's probably the most important stage of the entire process, especially the stakeholder interviews which we carried out with a number of different stakeholders and experts from either the government, NGOs, and the private sector. And this informed what we did a great deal and informed our conclusions a great deal. There's a wealth of experience, opinions, and expertise in the sector, and compiling all this information has been a great resource for us, and we hope for everybody who reads and makes use of our final report. Then moving on to the techno-economic modeling of the systems, the mini-grid optimization software Homer was linked via a Python program with GIS mapping software. GIS stands for Geographical Information Systems, for those of you who aren't familiar. And this allows the optimal mini-grid system design for a given location and system size to be determined for all areas across Nepal with a 1 kilometer squared resolution. Inputs for the spatial modeling included maps for wind resource, solar resource, and constructed maps for model diesel price and maintenance cost, which were constructed through methods I will describe shortly. Cost data, which was provided by the AEPC and representative of the visited mini-grid sites, was used to input into HOMA, which allows the capital expenditure, operational expenditure, and levelized cost of energy to be simulated for each location. So now I'll discuss, hopefully quite briefly, because I appreciate this is quite technical and I don't want to bore anybody. So the diesel price was modeled in the same way that Szabo did in his 2011 paper, Energy Solutions in Rural Africa, mapping electrification costs of distributed solar and diesel generation versus grid extension. This uses the equation shown here to calculate the diesel price for each location, which depends on the distance to the nearest pump plus the pump price for the fuel. The travel time used in this calculation was calculated through the global accessibility friction map with the reference provided here. So the price at each location in Nepal was calculated with this equation. And this is the map that results from the calculation. So this is clearly showing that in the lowlands and Terai region, more often than not, the diesel price is towards the lower end of the scale, whereas in the far northwest and mountainous and hill regions of Nepal, the price is quite higher and can even reach as high as $24 per litre. And that is often in incredibly high mountainous regions. Usually it's more towards the lower end of the spectrum. So for example, kind of around $2 per litre in the mountainous and hill regions. So this was calculated as well with the assumption that diesel can be bought from pumps in towns in Nepal at a price of 86 rupees per litre, which is a rough average value of the price over the past few years. Again, a little bit technical here. So this is the method by which maintenance costs were calculated across the country. So it's quite simple, despite looking quite complicated. It's essentially the fuel cost of the trip, the wages of the technician, and the lodging costs for the technicians over a multiple day maintenance trip. So spare parts are not covered here. Instead, these are reflected in the overhead and replacement costs that have already been input into HOMA. So this map here, this map is showing the maintenance costs with the two maintenance hubs considered being in Kathmandu and Biratnagar. So again, we can see here that the maintenance trip costs are higher in the more remote northwestern region of Nepal. So to determine the market size for off-grid systems, we need to determine where already has access to grid electrification or existing electrical infrastructure. So this map shows the existing grid structure, where the grid data has been taken from an online resource called OpenStreetMaps, which is an open source repository for data. It may not be complete, but is broadly geographically accurate, rather than just a schematic diagram of the grid. Similarly, the use of the light pollution in this way doesn't necessarily mean that the location is grid connected as such. The sites could be off-grid, but it is assumed that they have access to sufficient electricity already. There is a possibility, however unlikely, that some of these lights are forest fires and other natural phenomena, for example. But the reason I say this is unlikely is these phenomena tend to be less intense than the urban artificial lighting that has been used as a benchmark for this. So when we are considering areas that are already electrified, we take all of these points shown on this map, whether they are the nighttime light pollution or whether these are the red grid transmission lines, and we apply a 3-kilometer buffer around these and consider all areas within this buffer to be electrified already. So for the techno-economic modeling, we simulated a range of different system sizes based on a number of different household sizes. This was in order to accurately represent different population densities in different places. Obviously, a community in the more remote mountain regions would be potentially have fewer households to electrify, and the system would, as a result, require a lower capacity. So these were the system sizes that were input into Homer. The costs, sizes, and household numbers for which have been taken again from the cost data for some of the sites that we have visited during this project. And using this, we combined this with a population density map of Nepal and identified which size of system would be most appropriate for each location in Nepal. So this is the map I just mentioned. This is the household density map of Nepal. So you can see the more dense areas are highlighted in red, with the lower density areas in blue. The legend of the map on the left there highlights what number of households can be found per kilometer square. So each of these different colors, each of these different groups had a different system size, as I showed before, applied to it. So we can simulate the best option for each location. The results for each of these systems were allocated per this population density map to generate a final combined map of the optimized system for that location. So this final combined system indicates where the wind turbines would be most beneficial potentially for electrification efforts, and allows us to calculate the potential population served by these small wind hybrid grids, as well as the capital investment and annual operation expenses required for the operation of these grids. The final market size we can calculate by calculating the sum of all these system costs weighted by each population in areas further than 3 kilometers from the existing electrification zones we previously showed on the map a couple of slides ago. Now, coming to the end of the project, we carried out a stakeholder engagement workshop, which was incredibly useful, both to gather feedback on our preliminary results, but also to extract further expert opinion from the participants. We've since included this feedback in the results, and hopefully that's been taken into account sufficiently for the final report, which we will distribute amongst stakeholders. So that was, in essence, how the project went. So I'll now move on to the report. No, not the report, sorry, the results of the project. So the 6 solar wind hybrid systems that were surveyed, we collected questionnaires and technical information from them. These sites varied from different locations across Nepal. If you recall the maps we showed previously, and these sites have a different operational lifetime to date. So some of these systems have been quite recently installed. Some of them have been running from between 2 to 4 years. The oldest visited site had been running for 8 years. So we looked at the technical failures that occurred during this time, and over the history of the system, had a look at what events happened at different times during the installation. So what we have here is a pie chart showing the proportion of component failures during the first 3 years of the system. So this is the breakdown of different failures by the year of operation from the visited sites. So there have been quite a few data points for this, but what we can see is most of the faults with the wind turbines themselves are in fact a result of electrical or control systems. For example, where maybe the wind turbine has been braking when that's unnecessary. due to electrical constraints, or it has been a result of the non-operation of 2 wind turbines at the same time. So we're also seeing, especially in the first year, quite a lot of problems with the inverter. Again, in the second year, the problems have been with the inverter and largely with the electrical system. So what we've seen broadly across most of the sites is that the problems are not mechanical in nature. They are electrical, which indicates either there's a fault in the design perhaps, or a fault in the controller, or something has gone wrong somewhere with the electrical system, which has impacted on the rest of the system. Kimon, if I'm fudging all of this with the site visits, please jump in and correct me. So the typical technical issues that we identified with the systems that were visited, a lot of these sites are quite far away from existing repair centres, and given the low number of wind hybrid sites, there's not really the option of additional repair centres closer to the sites, as you know, a small number of sites does not justify a maintenance centre being implemented within the area. So often the repair centre being far away increases the mean time to repair of the system, which leads to longer downtimes. Occasionally, it's been the case that a failure has occurred with the system that has required external expertise from neighbouring countries to come and diagnose the system. Sometimes this is a case of the displays not working, and so diagnosis faults being difficult with the operator on site being unable to identify any issues. And then, as I said, the downtime can be quite high. Even when the system is in its service period of 3 years after the initial installation, the mean time to repair of these sites has typically been 3 months. During which, obviously, the community who still requires energy services have possibly reverted to using traditional energy sources. So that kind of undoes a lot of the progress that's been made. So with the inverter, a few of the faults that had been identified was, in one case, rats had eaten away some of the wires, which obviously is unideal. Circuit breakers have tripped because of problem in the distribution side of the system, which took a while to diagnose. There's been short-circuiting problems. There have been lightning strikes, which obviously have damaged the electrical system within the system in the inverter. And fuses have gone down, leading to circuit board issues. With the wind turbine and the charge controller, configuration issues with the charge controller and dump loads have led to either the overcharging of the battery or the dump load overheating, or occasionally both of these occurring. As mentioned, the braking mechanism with the wind turbine itself, whether mechanical or electrical, has led to the wind turbine not operating on occasion, despite there being adequate wind that is then not being utilised. As I mentioned again, the non-simultaneous operation of 2 wind turbines at the same time had been visually diagnosed. So that was a case of 2 wind turbines in the same time on the same site were not operating at the same time, which reduces obviously the effectiveness of the system. And in a lot of cases, the rated power of the wind turbine is in the 10 to 12 meters per second range, whereas the designs carried out and implemented in areas that have annual average wind speeds rather, of around 5 meters per second. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there, especially when sizing the system, assuming that the system will be benefited from by the entire rated capacity of the wind turbine all of the time, when obviously this is not true. And in some cases, standards and certifications on different components have either not been made or they have been invalid. So the results from the stakeholder interviews now. So drawing from the sum of all the stakeholder interviews that we carried out, we identified six key issues that were consistently raised and remarked upon. There were many more other points raised, but these six here were the most frequently discussed, so I will take some time to go through each of these points in detail. Not too much detail, so don't worry. So on the lines of the planning process, some of the sites have been selected despite the fact that they may have poor wind, and these have either been chosen due to anecdotal evidence. For example, a member of the community remarking that the site has fantastic wind resource, even though they're saying that on the basis that for a few months in the year there is great wind resource, but with little consideration that for a wind turbine to be viable, obviously it needs to be in operation for as much of the year as possible. Or indeed, it may be chosen for based on a relatively short measurement campaign. Now, ideally, a measurement campaign would be carried out for 2 years or more. 1 year at the very least, so we can see the seasonal effects, 2 years preferably, so we can make sure that the initial measurement year is not a one-off. Another difficulty in the planning process is the existing uncertainty in grid connection. So at the moment, there is no clear grid connection strategy in Nepal. So there is no available map for, at least as far as I'm aware, and in fact many of the stakeholders are aware, there is no map given for the planned grid connections. And now that the energy planning responsibilities are at the municipality level, this uncertainty may indeed increase. And obviously, if you are a private investor in an off-grid system, this is an unnecessary risk. You don't want to invest on a mini grid system that is close to the grid, especially if that grid may be extended within the near future and you don't know about it. There is an incomplete point here. So the demand growth is often larger than, I can complete that point verbally. The demand growth in the system is often larger than what is expected. So when an off-grid area sees electrification, the demand growth either is a result of increasing appliances being used, more and more energy-hungry appliances, or indeed migration to the site, as this site now has access to electricity and is more a desirable place to live. So as a result of this, and potentially due to failures in the system and long periods of downtime, there is a failure to deliver productive end uses, which has a direct impact on the end user's ability to pay for the system and the overall financial sustainability of the project. One of the other factors here is the low initial capex is desired, so capex being the initial capital investment of the system. So investors and installers obviously want a low capital investment to reduce the risk, but this can be a bit of a false economy because a poor quality or lower quality installation can result in increased maintenance problems down the line. This results in failed projects, as I've said. People are unable to carry out productive end uses, they're unable to pay tariffs, and so the system might not be financially sustainable despite the fact initially it was of a lower initial capital investment. So it might be the case that higher capital investment is desirable to then allow for lower long-term commitments. So in terms of the operating models, now by operating models we mean the way in which the system is administrated, maintained, financed, and managed. So when the first point there is talking about anchored business models, to briefly explain what an anchored business model is, that is where, for example, an external private organization acts as an anchor load. For example, a telecoms company with a telecommunications tower on the mini-grid, which is powered by the mini-grid, and then this effectively subsidizes the end users and allows them to benefit from the economy of scale that is inherently found in mini-grid operation. When with systems, they require long-term viability, or it will require continued financial assistance. Now, what this means is the system needs to be financially viable for the duration of its lifetime. Otherwise, it may be the case that 5 or 6 years after the system is installed, there may need to be an external cash injection to pay for replacements to the batteries or other components. Now, that's not too difficult when there are 1 or 2 sites, but when there's a great number of sites, as is desired, to electrify as many people as possible, this puts a tremendous burden on whoever is responsible for looking after the sites. And then if the revenue and tariff collection is low, this will be reflected in low maintenance, as people are unable to afford the maintenance or unable to afford the electricity, which then is reflected in systems failing, trust decreases, components can't be replaced, and ultimately the system unfortunately fails. Indeed, at present, the installer is contracted for a service period of 3 or 5 years after the installation is made. But after this service period, communities are responsible for arranging their own maintenance, which either is with the same provider as previously or with a different engineering company. But communities can struggle to take care of the system either on their own or with making contact with these external organizations. Although at present the AEPC does offer assistance in setting up contacts with these maintenance providers. As I mentioned and alluded to before, there's often a case that the site can't afford to save the funds for batteries, whether these funds are going to maintenance providers or other replacements. It has the same effect essentially. Once the system has been in operation for 6-7 years or longer, the batteries are starting to degrade in quality, and they need to be replaced for the system to be viable and to survive further. And often this isn't the case. The funds are not saved. And then the donation-led model. There needs to be a distinction between donation and led models, which are important, and productive end-use models. So a system doesn't necessarily have to be both. Donation-led models are very important for those with the lowest ability to pay, to make sure that everyone is provided with electricity. But in areas where it's appropriate, productive end uses should absolutely be employed in order to develop the economic power of the community and their ability to pay for the electricity and the provision of the system over its lifetime. So with predictive end-use models, there needs to be a well-defined tariff collection structure and good maintenance provision in place for it to survive. But the same applies to donation-led models, really. Maintenance is key. So this topic is more aimed at the private sector. So this was one of the key topics discussed with some of the private sector stakeholders, who are at present reluctant to engage with not just small wind, but off-grid electrification efforts as a whole, because quite a lot of initial capital is required for the system itself, but also initial capital is required for the community to establish productive end uses. A company cannot simply be set up without any investment overnight. The community needs to be able to establish this productive end use before it can start earning money on it and before it can start subsidizing the use of the electrical infrastructure. In a lot of places in Nepal, very high subsidy rates are required so that communities can afford the tariffs that are set. Sometimes these tariffs aren't paid, which reduces, again, the financial viability of the system. More so with wind projects than other projects, unfortunately. The O&M risk is quite high. Private sector stakeholders are hesitant to engage. They're reluctant to put forward equity, even if the risk is being reduced through external financial organizations. Basically, uncertainty is the problem here. The private sector is unwilling to engage until the concept of small off-grid wind and other renewable technologies is proven and shown to be working and shown to be a viable business model. For example, banks in Nepal are required to invest in some area of development, for example, in energy or agriculture, but most banks tend to go for agricultural investment as these projects see quite a lower risk than off-grid energy projects. So there is an ongoing question of how do we encourage private sector involvement? Is it a case of making sure that everything else is in place and then hoping that these things encourage the private sector, or do we need to try and encourage these private sector stakeholders through other means? And that's a question that remains to be answered. Going back to, in my opinion, what is the key issue? Maintenance. So long mean time to repair for the system results in frustration, unwillingness to engage with the system from end users. A big problem is the accessibility of sites from maintenance hubs, but that's understandable given the difficult terrain of Nepal. It's difficult to change that. It's a bit of a chicken and the egg question. What comes first, a large number of installations or a maintenance hub? Because you need a maintenance hub to sustain a large number of systems, but you can't have a large number of systems if they're not receiving adequate maintenance beforehand. So it's difficult to know which one to place first. I mean, ideally, it would be a case of implementing both of these things at the same time. But obviously that's not feasible because that would require a huge capital investment, and that's something that just isn't possible. There's also the question of preventative maintenance versus repairs. So preventative maintenance is where technicians go and ensure that the system is being run properly, or whether it's operating properly and catching small problems before they evolve into big problems. Now, obviously, it's more maintenance is better, but there's a limit, a financial limit to that. If we were conducting maintenance trips to a site every week, the system would probably never fail, but that would be a ridiculous amount of money to be spending, and probably too much on the maintenance side of things. So there needs to be some trade-off between the maintenance that's carried out and the financial benefits of that, and that sweet spot, if you will, needs to be found. The mini-grid projects tend to benefit quite a lot from an economy of scale, which I've previously mentioned. The more number of consumers that are involved with the project, the more kind of the small problems tend to average out. For example, if one person is not paying tariffs in a mini grid of 20 consumers, this could be a problem. But in a mini grid of 100 consumers, this is much less of a problem proportionally. So there is an economy of scale here. And in terms of maintenance, the accumulation of small faults due to the lack of maintenance, lack of preventative maintenance, results in declining trust in end users, which is not only frustrating for the end users, but it decreases their perception of the energy in question. But also it's demoralizing, to say the least. So we have this lovely virtuous circle of good maintenance, which leads to productive end uses, which leads to revenue generation, which enables further good maintenance. So that's great if that can happen, but more often than not, it's this that we see. It's poor maintenance. It's the inability of productive end users. It's the lack of revenue generation, which again lends itself again to poor maintenance. So there's two sides of the same coin. We can have fantastic maintenance that leads and goes on and on. But again, it's which of these happens first. All of these things, going back to the positive aspect, all of these things need to happen at the same time. Otherwise, we get this, which is undesirable. Another key factor is the technical quality and certification of components and the system as a whole. So in some cases, certification is lacking. We need a guarantee of quality for not just the wind turbine, but all the other components as well. So there's been problems in the past with substandard components being issued with some kind of standard compliance certification that in the end turns out to be either meaningless or just invalid. And sometimes even meeting legitimate standards isn't enough. There may well be a gap between the standards on paper and what is required in reality in this context, and there needs to be some work performed to identify if there is a gap here, which we believe there may be, and define this gap more than we have been able to within the scope of this project. Also, guidelines and recommendations for the system design and installation may be needed to minimize the chances of future failure. The graph I have here is alluding to the trade-off between CapEx and OpEx, between capital investment and operational investment, as I've mentioned before. It's what this diagram, rather than a graph, represents is the fact that high capital investment results in lower operational investment, but also lower capital investment results in a higher requirement for the annual operational costs. What this little the kind of the curve represents is there may well be a sweet spot where the capital investment and operational investment combined in a total is lower than it would be in other areas. So, for example, a middling capital investment results in a fairly decent system, which then only needs a small amount of intervention throughout its lifetime. So this could be more cost effective than otherwise. So the big one, the policy issues. So as I mentioned previously, recently devolved powers within Nepal regarding energy access and energy planning. It's now the responsibility of local governments and municipalities. The question is, do these governments and do these municipalities have the information and capacity necessary to make these fully informed decisions? Many will be, but then that leaves some who will not be, unfortunately. The tender process can be difficult for Nepali companies to fulfill, as these can be competing with international companies who are already benefiting from an economy of scale in their own country. So these external companies are able to produce the system at lower costs, given that they are already producing systems within their own country. So this is obviously undesirable because there needs to be local capacity. There needs to be local capacity because if the manufacturer is in country and as close to the site as possible, then the expertise to diagnose any faults within the site or provide any repairs is there. We don't need to wait for someone from outside the country to come and make any diagnosis or any repairs. So another problem is after the service period, that's 3 or 5 years, the installer may not be as fast to respond to the community as previously, as the focus of the organization has shifted to a new project. So, for example, with the AEPC, the model means that they rapidly move from one project to the next, which is fantastic because it ensures that many projects are implemented and as many people as possible benefit from the technology. But this does mean that post-installation, sometimes the attention can move to the next project. And, excuse me. And with this attention shifting to the next project, the maintenance administration of the site can be largely left to the contracted maintenance provider, which may or may not always be the best option. So as well, there's quite a dire need to increase responsiveness during and after the service period. If there is a fault with the system, it will get repaired. It's just a case of how long will that repair take. Now, as I mentioned previously, the average mean time to repair was 3 months, which is quite a long time, especially if you're going without electricity services that you've gotten used to, that you've not taken for granted, but adapted to. So these communities are reverting to their previous energy habits. So as I mentioned, the progress made by installing these renewable systems has been lost. So there needs to be some kind of way to encourage prompt and fast reaction to any faults. So that includes communication between the site and the maintenance provider, but also the speed at which the maintenance provider can make these repairs. So this can be limited by the distance from the maintenance hub to the site, but it can also be an issue of the supply chain. So again, having a Nepali manufacturer making these systems, the supply chain will be much improved to what it is at present. Because at the moment, a lot of these systems, a lot of these components are manufactured outside of the country. But once more, the question is, it's a chicken and the egg situation where we need a large number of systems to justify having a manufacturer locally, but the local manufacture cannot take place if there isn't a large enough demand. So hopefully this project and the results that we're showing goes some ways to defining the demand that exists. Another thing, and this is quite important, especially for areas close to the grid, is that there needs to be a power purchasing agreement for grid connection with wind solar hybrid systems. At the moment, I believe there is a power purchase agreement in place for solar systems, and I may be wrong, but also wind systems. But the wind solar hybrid systems are a bit of a grey area. So this could be relatively easily addressed, but it would need to be addressed to reduce this uncertainty with grid connection. What I mean by a power purchase agreement is the ability for the mini grid to be connected to the grid as it is extended and to export electricity onto the grid rather than the grid arriving and the generation assets within the site just becoming redundant because these people now have access to the grid. That's something we want to avoid if possible. So all of these points and many more besides, I tried to be brief. I'm not sure I succeeded, but I tried nonetheless, will feed into the final report and the recommendations that have been made here to help, hopefully, the small wind and off-grid electrification sectors in Nepal progress further. So this is quite a map-heavy section, which is great if, like me, you love maps, but unfortunately not everyone loves maps. I think they're quite useful. So this here is a map of the model cost of energy for the optimal system designed by location in Nepal. So this is for the medium-sized system. So this is for a grid serving approximately 83 households. So you can see, again, the northwestern mountainous and hilly region of Nepal has the higher cost of energy, whereas the eastern Terai region of Nepal down in the southeast benefits from a lower cost of energy. And this is due to a number of things. This is either due to the presence of renewable resources, the lower cost of maintenance, or a combination of those. And so this, again, for the same size grid for 83 households, this is the recommended capacity of wind turbines for systems within different locations in Nepal. So unfortunately, when we see on the previous slide, if we go back, the most costly region is in the northwest. It's also the region that seems to be the most viable for small wind. So there needs to be some kind of acknowledgement of that. And again, it's a question of what's needed first, whether there needs to be sufficient number of systems or whether the maintenance center needs to be implemented there first. But I think that's a very difficult question to answer, and there may not be a suitable answer for that. It may just be what happens in practice. So those maps I showed previously were for just one system size, assumed to be blanketed across the entirety of Nepal. Obviously, that's not the case. So the next maps I'm going to show you are the combined maps for different system size weighted by population density. Sorry, not population density, the population within each location. So this is also the maps. These maps are also with the assumed electrification zones removed. So this is the same map as I showed before. This is the capacity of wind turbines for the optimal system design, but this is for the optimal system size as well. So if we look at this map closely, we can see there are hotspots which are highlighted in orange in different locations within Nepal. These are the locations that we are anticipating will be viable sites for future installation. Now, the orange classification is greater than 7.5 kilowatts. If I remember correctly, this goes from 7.5 to 20 kilowatts. So there is quite a market there. There's for larger systems. But then there are smaller systems as well. For example, there's a patch towards the middle of the Terai region of yellow, which indicates that small wind is desirable in this location, but only a small amount to the existing systems there. So this may be a case of, excuse me, this may be a case that the majority of the energy needs in that system are provided by solar PV, but a small amount of wind will help the system survive and generate the electricity for the system. And here's the map for the cost of energy for the same systems that have been showed previously. So once again, the lower cost of energy is towards the Terai and in the east of the country, whereas the higher costs tend to be in more remote areas in the west of the country. But if you look closely, which I'm not sure whether you're able to, but you can make out points of blue even within the far west of the country, which indicate a lower cost of energy. So these are the locations that we're going to that we can say will be potentially the most viable for wind installations or wind hybrid mini grid installations. So in our final report, we can go into more detail discussing this and illustrate which of these locations may be most viable. So according to the maps that I've showed previously, there are approximately 12.7 million people within these areas. Now, at the moment, I think the population of Nepal is approaching 30 million people, and the electrification rate of the country is around 90%. So obviously there are people within this region we've highlighted that do have access to electricity already, but we can justify this by assuming that we don't know what their level of energy access is essentially, without more up-to-date grid maps and without better delineation between electrified areas and unelectrified areas. So these are the people we consider to be viable for mini-grid implementation. Now, some of these mini-grids may be grid-connected, some of these may be isolated, islanded, for example. But with these 12.7 million people, To implement all these systems would require an investment of $1.46 billion and an annual expenditure of $110 million per year. So this effectively is the size of the market identified by the Market Assessment Project. In terms of per person costs, this equates to only $114 per person in capital investment and $8.66 per person per year in operational expenditure. So hopefully this goes some way of quantifying the market in Nepal, even though there are some caveats regarding who may be electrified already and who might not be electrified. So moving on to the recommendations and conclusions identified by all of this. So systems benefit from more diverse generation. So the more different types of generation in a system, for example, wind, solar, microhydro, diesel, etc., then the lower the cost of energy will be, as each of these different types of generation will have peaks at different times, other than hydro and diesel, I guess, which are different. But the more different types of generation, the lower the chance of system failure generally. There needs to be a wind turbine testing facility in Nepal in order to facilitate local manufacture and in order to ensure adherence to standards. Additionally, solar wind hybrid system installation guidelines and standards need to be formulated and enforced. In terms of changing public perception, a few high quality installations can help basically win the war of hearts and minds. It's a question of ensuring that people are aware of the potential of the technology and don't regard it as in the same way that they would regard the failures in the early years of the sector, such as the catastrophic incident in Kakbeni I mentioned. But also, as I mentioned before, the contracts with the installers and the system maintainers would benefit from having a stipulation that includes the fact that post-installation payments for the service period should be performance-based. For example, payments for successful operation of system will be made, but payments could be withheld if the system has a mean time to repair exceeding a certain limit that should be set. Which would preferably be lower than 3 months, because 3 months is a long time to go without a system that you have been getting used to and relying upon. In order to ensure that tariff collection is made and to avoid non-payment of the tariff, prepaid metering should be employed as standard. Now, prepaid metering is becoming more popular and is seeing implementation within some of the sites, some of the more recent sites, but this should be a standard thing across the board. Additionally, a relationship with a reliable manufacturer should be developed, preferably within country, in order to assure that the expert technical assistance is available and on hand to as many sites as possible. Also, if the wind turbine installations and implementation is to be scaled up, there needs to be more maintenance hubs. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit here. I'm laboring the point a little bit maybe, but this is a necessity in order to reduce the maintenance trip costs. For example, the maps I showed previously highlighting that the potential for systems is greatest in the northwest of the country. It would be ideal to implement a maintenance centre as close to there as possible. But I do recognise the fact that it may not be feasible to do this until there is a significantly larger number of installations made. So during the pre-installation feasibility study of the system, the generation and load forecasting of the system needs to be quite precisely modelled with software tools covering at least 10 years of operation of the system, with special attention given to the battery lifetime. So one of the big things with the systems that we've analysed is that the batteries fail before the end users are able to pay for replacements, which either ends up with the system failing outright or requires a large cash injection from an external agency, which, as I've said before, is not sustainable, especially for a large number of systems. So, aside from the study we've performed here, more rigorous studies of installed projects are needed in order to develop specific solutions, both for technical and financial models. The component standards need to be specified more accurately, while at the same time considering the financial viability of the components. Sometimes, again, high quality components are more expensive, but will last longer. There's a less likelihood for failure there, so there's a lower risk essentially. So sites also need to be categorized distinctly on different factors, such as the ability to pay of sites and the scope of the productive end uses, in order to essentially identify whether the system fits within the donor-led model or the productive end use model better. And the minimum period of postal installation service needs to be clearly identified for each system. So this may be different for a productive end use system or a donor-led system. For example, a donor-led system, it's incredibly unlikely that the end users in the donor-led system would be able to afford post-service period maintenance. Based on the fact that these end users are the end users with the lowest ability to pay and no potential for productive end uses. But conversely, if there are systems with viable productive end uses and successful productive end uses, then the service period may be lower. It may be a case that these people are able to pay for their own maintenance quite soon, maybe within 3 years or so. So the last point there is the fact that only once there is a degree of certainty with viable productive end uses and viable market, only then will the private sector even think of participating and be willing to engage. Otherwise, they're going to stick to their previous activities. They're not going to diversify and start investing in wind power. I'm almost at the end. Don't worry about that. So, to ensure reliability, the wind turbines need to be tested in standard testing centres. So at the moment, there isn't a testing centre such as this within Nepal, but collaborations can be made with third parties such as Nordic Folkecenter from Denmark or Neway in India, who can provide certifications for the turbines in order to avoid the high upfront costs of IEC or other compliant products. So one of the solutions to the maintenance hub question, which I've laboured quite a lot, I think, is to potentially combine expertise. So, for example, have a combined maintenance hub for solar PV, for hydro, for wind, and for other off-grid technologies. And in this way, there'll be a concentration of expertise, there'll be a concentration of infrastructure. And in this way, the number of sites that need to be implemented before the maintenance center is viable can be reduced. So for the decentralization of energy planning, capacity building projects need to be implemented. So the municipalities need to be aware of different resources that are available to them, and they need to be aware of the standard practices that are prevalent in the industry. Rigorous GIS studies such as the one implemented here should be initiated to raise awareness in rural municipalities and to enable the development of off-grid renewable energy strategy. So the best case would be an easily navigated and understood database of existing studies and data, such as the maps produced here in the report, which will be issued shortly. And again, recent grid data is hard to obtain, not just for Nepal, but for across the world. Wider circulation of this information would be greatly beneficial. It would highlight the successes of electrification in different contexts, but also highlight the work that still needs to be done. So better delineate the difference between areas that require electrification and the areas that already have existing electricity access. And thank you very much. I'll take any questions now, but I see that we already have a few in the chat. We have quite a few, don't we, Kimon? Kimon, would you like to help me answer any of these questions? I think you've had a longer time to take a look at these.
Hey Alfie, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. I hope I enjoyed it quite a lot, although I've seen all the analysis details and everything. But I hope all the people, our attendees, has enjoyed. Maybe not as much as I did, but hopefully
maybe not.
a bit. All right. So actually, yes, Alfie, we've got quite a few amount of questions, and actually, I have to add very interesting questions. These are questions from Jessica. So should we go step by step? I mean, question by question.
Yeah, I
think address.
If we start at the beginning, that would make sense, I think. So the first question is, I will read this out for those of you listening after the webinar. The first question is it fair to assume that most of the downtime of the turbine is due to the electronic system getting damaged or needing maintenance themselves? So should it not be seen as a negative on the turbine? Jessica also says she likes the pie graphs, so fantastic. That was your pie graph, so well done, Kimon.
All right, so Alfred, should I answer
go ahead.
question? Maybe I should go with this. Actually, we've missed a small. Actually, I think I would say important thing. So most of the small wind turbines that we've installation sites that we've visited through this market assessment project are basically the commercial wind turbines. I think that needs to be clarified.
That's true.
And the locally fabricated wind turbine system are not as much popular, and all these installation sites are projects implemented by government of Nepal, an institution called Alternative Energy Promotion Center. So it needs to be specified by saying that most of the small wind turbines that are implemented widely are commercial wind turbines. The question about the downtime of the turbine associated with the electronic part is that we visited just 6 number of sites, and in most of the sites, the turbines especially were not maintained over the length of their operating time. There was only one wind turbine which was maintained, and that was because of the blade breaking apart. So the maintenance of the wind turbine is rather than a preventive maintenance, it's the maintenance that is done once the technical issues are recorded.
It's a repair.
It's a repair maintenance. So from our site surveys, especially talking quite extensively with the operators of the system at the site, we've identified few things where a few of the wind turbines not operating were mostly due to the electronic items, specifically the wind charge controllers, and a few of the problems that was reported to us by the technicians were once the wind charge controllers were repaired, the wind turbine was back to operation. So there were like few instances from the site where we have recorded these issues with the because of the charge controller, the wind turbine is not operating properly. But most of the data that we've collected, the technical issues that we've collected from the site are very not as much rich in amount. So the frequency of failures does not have a particular characteristic or a trend.
Mhm.
Um, so uh, I think, yeah, if we have like a little bit rich amount of information in terms of
Mhm.
the nature of the failure when we diagnose all a bigger amount or a lot of quantities of small wind turbine system, maybe we can say that the fault is actually because of this reason in this specific cases.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, yeah.
I think the difficulty with small wind installations in particular is when we're doing this kind of this project. Um, there's a relatively few number of systems, especially in Nepal. Um, so the data that we can extract from these visits will be lower than ideal. Obviously, we'd like to assess as many sites as possible, but it might be the case that ideally we would have more data than we're able to obtain. So the second question, before I get too deep into that, is what kind of training is provided to the communities for the maintenance? Kimon, would you like to discuss that?
Yeah, so about the training, uh, the standard methodology that is practiced for the standard installations, commercial wind turbine installation, is that once the installation is complete, the installers are required to uh, train a person who is nominated by the village as a system operator. So the kind of training that the system nominated system operator has to go through is basically uh, the basic house wiring system. So in events like an extra household is to be electrified, the system operator has to have skills uh, to do the house wiring work and tap the line from the transmission pole to that specific household. So one is the house wiring work, and basically the installer also trains the operator the basic of the system operation and the basic wiring between the charge controllers and the batteries and the wind turbines. So those kind of operation in terms of, for example, if there are specific wiring issues, the operator is basically trained to diagnose where and what kind of issues exist just by looking through the wiring stuff where there might be any kind of abnormalities present or not. So those are like very basic kind of trainings. But normally when there is a problem in at the site, the wind turbines are generally not able to diagnose what the problem is. This has been the kind of issues that has been reported by the system operators from the site. So in most cases, the installers themselves have to uh, go back to the site and diagnose, and then based on the diagnosis, then come back to the repair center, uh, get the instruments and failed components, and then go back for the repair.
Mhm.
In general case.
Mhm. Okay, that covers that question quite nicely, I hope. Um, so one of the questions as well is do we initiate the conversation of having a savings fund for when the batteries need to be replaced? I'll quickly sum up that. I think in I don't think the end users have the ability to apply a savings fund. Obviously, some kind of fund needs to be in place, whether that's on the side of the maintenance providers or the installers. But often the tariffs are too high for payment, and it's just not viable for the communities themselves to employ some kind of savings fund to pay for these batteries. Would you agree with that assessment, Kimon?
Again, the methodology that is practiced for especially for solar wind hybrid system by AEPC is that a beneficiary committee is set up before the project initiates, and which is in presence of all the members of the community, and therefore there is a cooperative account that is initiated at first by the beneficiary committee. And once the project is commissioned and the electricity is distributed to all the users, the tariff collected from the users is supposed to go to the cooperative account. But the issue is the same as you've mentioned, Alfred, because the tariffs that has been collected over the years are generally not enough to repair the batteries, to replace the batteries. That kind of
Sure.
costs are usually not, the revenue generation is not as enough to replace the batteries over the 4 year or 5 year period. Uh, uh, so I think just to add this a little bit, there are many issues once the installation is finished, because the previous trends in Nepal has been because of the lack of proper service and maintenance. Uh, the downtime is pretty high, and once the downtime of the system is pretty high, people uh, are not do not have the access to electricity anymore. So if these kind of repeated trends comes again and again, then the people do not feel obligated to pay the tariff to the utility. And in this case, again, the revenue, there is a big strike to the revenue, and as soon as uh, the monthly revenue is not generated, uh, the timely repair and maintenance, such as like replacing the batteries, cannot happen in a periodic manner. So it's kind of like a loop
Yeah,
trend where it
it's
starts with
the
the service. Yeah.
it's the diagram I showed earlier, isn't it?
Yeah.
The negative circle. Once
Yes.
once tariffs can't be paid, then maintenance can't happen, and if maintenance doesn't happen, then the system fails, and you're back to square one essentially.
Yeah. And I think the question especially associated with the cost of replacing the batteries
Hmm.
is also quite deeply associated with the levelized cost of electricity. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that needs to be rigorously studied, uh, which
Hmm.
should include and incorporate all kinds of costs. For example, the capital costs, subsidies, and the cost of replacing the batteries over the period of 10 to 15 years, and see what kind of cost of energy comes out
I think
with it, which has not been. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the problem when doing this sort of techno-economic modeling, such as what I did before, is it's difficult to account for all eventualities. So one recommendation that I didn't mention in the slides was that sensitivity analyses need to be employed. So, for example, rather than just um, performing the modeling with a relatively optimistic outlook on what the lifetime of the battery would be, it would be interesting to see how the modeling is affected when the battery lifetime is, for example, maybe only 4 or 5 years, as the case may be in some sites, because obviously the battery system, being one of the most expensive components of the entire system,
Hmm.
will have a huge impact on the levelized cost of energy, as you say.
Hmm.
Mhm.
That's
So,
right.
so the next question we have is, can we get the private sector to help with the maintenance issues, as they already have high-level process for their systems, which their processes can help us create one tailored small wind turbines? So I think this is referring to the question of whether we can have the private sector conducting maintenance services, and indeed that is what is happening. But not at a particularly large scale. But that is predominantly due to the fact that there aren't that many wind turbine installation sites. So that's what happens at the moment. The private sector is contracted to provide maintenance services for a period after the installation. But then after that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kimon, after that, it's down to the community to contract these service providers to perform maintenance services.
Yes, that is right, Alfred. And most of the time, the people in the community are unaware regarding where to go for the maintenance and repair service, and it just gets stuck most of the time after a few years once the service period is over, which might also, I mean, reflect in terms of like the installers not, interested in doing the repairs as the cost is pretty high for them
Sure.
to, the cumulative cost is pretty high, and the ability of the community to pay for the repairs might be, not as much
But
in terms of what they
this,
have generated in the revenue.
yeah, this goes back to the recommendation we just made of making sure that the post installation service period payments shouldn't be made based on just the contract being signed. The payments need to be made for successful maintenance, for successful operation of the system. I think at the moment it's a case that if the system is visited once or twice, then the service contract will be upheld. But there needs to be some kind of stipulation in the contract that says if the system has a downtime of more than 3 weeks, for example, then there is a reduction to the amount to be paid at the end of the year. If it happens, if there's more than one instance of long downtime, then the amount to be paid should decrease to incentivize the operation of the system, to incentivize the prompt and timely maintenance and repairs.
Yeah. I mean, just to add a little bit, instead of like private sectors, going for the maintenance, repairs stuff after the project, I think it is important to explore the areas where the private sector wants to develop the entire project and own the project for a definite interval of time. For example, maybe like 10 years and 15,
Sure.
20 years, and see if that's profitable for them, where these kind of maintenance repair issues and downtime will not I think will not be as frequent as what we've seen in the
Yeah,
south.
yeah. If the private investor has some kind of excuse me, if it has some kind of sunk cost into the system and some investment, essentially,
Exactly.
then it'll be the case that
Yeah.
they're much more inclined and incentivized to take better care of the system.
Yeah.
Um,
But again, the issue is that most of the off-grid areas might lie in places where there might not be it might not be much profitable for the private sectors.
mhm,
So that's another question which needs to be modeled in terms of like a
sure.
different kind of operation model, which needs to be
Mhm,
prioritized by the government of Nepal.
mhm. So
Right.
I think we've covered that question. I hope we have.
Uh-huh.
So the next question,
Yep.
this is the penultimate question at the moment, is have you tried training the community or a specific person to be the technician in local community? In Peru, we have discovered that if you spend some time training one person, it becomes a valuable resource for the community. We invite the technician to be trained for 3 weeks at our workshop, and this has been proving to help with the maintenance issues that are needed in the community without us having to go frequently. So we've
This is
kind of
an excellent question.
yeah, we've touched upon this, haven't we? But please, come on,
Yeah.
take it away.
Uh, so CAPIC recently, actually on 2017, completed a project where we had installed a uh, locally constructed small wind turbine in hybrid with solar wind system, but the overall capacity of the system was not as much as compared to the to the install capacity of the sites that we visited for the market assessment project, but still, just in terms of training the community members, it's pretty obvious that no matter how much training that you give, it will come short if you are giving the training to a person who has no technical background. So for this specific project last year, what we did was we anchored a repair and maintenance and repair center, which repair center at a city very close to the site, maybe like 2 to 3 hours far away from the installation site. And we investigated this repair center in terms of its capacity and invited them to participate in the various phases of the project quite early from the project. For example, when the small wind turbine construction course was happening, we invited the system operators, which was nominated by the village, to take part in the training program. Again, during the installation and maintenance drill, we made the technicians at this particular city and the system operators to rigorously, participate in all activities of this maintenance and installation activities. So this definitely gives a little bit more, reliability in terms of, building the technical capacity of these technicians, instead of like just giving a few weeks of training after the installation. But it will be some time until we diagnose how much impact does this kind of training models would create in the future. But definitely, I think a proper amount of training needs to be given right from the, I think, beginning of the project, in terms of like securing a proper reliability of the system. Hello?
Oh, sorry, there was a problem then.
All right.
No, I just said thanks for that, Kimon. A good answer to that question, I think. And I think this is the last question. Yeah, it seems to be. It says again, maybe getting the private sector to help us with certification issues. That might be something they want to help us with. I think there needs to be some kind of independent oversight, both independent from the government and from the private sector, really, some kind of NGO that takes care of these things. But certainly, I think there's potential for a private sector operation of a testing site. For example, you go and pay for time, you go and pay to have your component certified, and then that component can then go on and participate in installations in the future. That would be my view on things, although you may disagree, you may agree.
I mean, in terms of certification, there are two different angles. One would be certification for the locally fabricated system, which there do not exist until yet, which is also quite a bit of demand in terms of CAPEC, currently seeking for, actually. But before talking about the locally fabricated system, we had to demonstrate that locally fabricated wind turbine system could be one of a viable solution for increasing the reliability in terms of quick repair and maintenance aspects, or even some reflecting to the cost aspects of it. But yeah, it's not been much demonstrated, and all the past projects that has been done has not built up much confidence to the stakeholders in terms of the performance of the locally constructed wind turbine system. So I mean, before certification, I think the developer needs some kind of confidence in terms of these locally fabricated system can actually work or not over the duration. And another thing is that the certification of the for of the commercial wind turbines, which means usually to avoid high upfront cost, the developers do not well, this was previously at least, which they do not demanded much stricter certifications, which led again to what you've already mentioned, Alfred, like low quality products infiltrating our country. So I mean, again, this is the same issue. This is the same context where the quality of the components, which is like uh, deeply associated with the certification and the cost, the balance of these two things need to be identified just to secure the reliability of the system over the at least minimum amount of years over the time.
Okay,
Yep.
I think that comprehensively answers all those questions. So I realise we've probably gone over time now, so thank you for everyone who's stuck with us. But I think we'll call an end to the webinar now. So thank you to those who are listening now, and well, I suppose it will be now for those who are listening after the webinar itself. But thank you for your attendance, and if you have any questions, please get in touch either through the Wind Empowerment website, or if you have our emails already, you'll be able to contact us in that way. And
also, to add
go
to
ahead.
this, Alfred, there will be a report that we will send to all the stakeholders in Nepal, and also make the report with much detail. I mean, with a kind of like detailed analysis of the site issues, which will be made eventually online on the public platform.
Sure.
So
I mean,
yeah, just to add that.
believe it or not, this presentation has actually been quite brief. We've skipped a lot of the detail, which will
Yep.
be included in the report. So for those interested in hearing more of that, yeah, we can be sure to provide access to the report at the end. So without dragging this out any further, thank you very much for attending, and we hope you engage with wind empowerment, you engage with small wind, you engage with CAPEG in the future. We'd love to collaborate with you. Okay, thanks.
Okay.